So first of all, I think Australia has this concept of an ecosystem for innovation, and an observation is that not a lot of countries have that concept of an ecosystem for innovation, and it's been very, very pointed at trying to identify that in the key parameters, and that came through the Cutler review as well, which I think was quite useful. And it's very clear that there's a huge amount of investment, and I think Larry alluded to this earlier, that goes into research, fundamental research and research further downstream to try and build a very good, strong IP base. The universities are very well funded in that respect, despite what they may say, and they have been, at least for the last few years. It may change going forward. But we also have CSIRO, there's a huge amount of put in for that. NICTA, I think, has been referred to as well. So there's a lot of money that goes into research right across the spectrum, from biotechnology through to ICT, through to physics, through to a whole range of them. And out of that comes some really good ideas. And there has been some successful commercialisation and innovation come out of that. We've got wireless, which I think is one of the flagship ones. There are many other biotechs, there's Gardasil, which is another flagship type one. There's another one in terms of phased array radar, which has come out of a local company in the Canberra region. It was put on US Navy ships before it was put on Australian ships, very well respected. So that there are any number of these, so it is successful. But there's still, I think, a gap. There's a gap between coming out of the IP from the university into that innovation chain, which then gets it out there to have a net benefit for the nation. So from my perspective, where I sit within the university, that's what my challenge is. My challenge is that I know there's a lot of good IP there. I know there's a lot of bright people there, and I know there's a lot of willingness to try and engage more outside the university. The question is how to do this. And I think it's in creating that environment in order for that to happen, both at the local level, but also I think at the national level that needs to be able to be facilitated.
Michael, I might get you to stop there and come back to you in a second on that. Adrian, you've, whoops, you're right, I pressed the wrong button. Adrian, you have written a fairly controversial book recently called Blue Sky Mining about this very problem in the ecosystem, and I took the liberty of making this graphic myself with my cat, which isn't in your book. No animals were harmed in this photo. But I guess the question I got when I read your book for the 5th time was, where's the money in the ecosystem? And so I put this chart together. 8 billion in R&D, institutes and universities, etc. 2 billion in private equity. 1.55 trillion, actually 1.7 trillion in the markets, superannuation funds and the future fund, etc., which is, by the way, bigger than the market cap of the Silicon Valley 150. So there's a lot of cash there. But there's 100 million a year going into investing in commercialization of technology in the private space, private money, venture money. So this shocked me when I saw this, and I sort of began to understand a different kind of valley of death going from universities to companies. These are some charts from your book. Do you want to walk us through your conclusions?
Yeah, so this is what you're looking at here is if you believe that we're moving to a world that's more information-based, and the countries that are going to dominate are the countries that are going to be able to build technology-based businesses and new billion-dollar businesses. You want to begin with some sort of comparative advantage in those emerging industries. And what this graph is showing, which is UN data, is that of the 25 areas that Australia has comparative advantage relative to the world, 24 of them are commodities based, and the 25th one is alcohol and beverages.
How about the innovation issue?
Yeah, so this came from a government innovation report, and what this is showing is what proportion, the proportion of different types of innovators by firm size, and there's different things. So new to market international innovator is a company that develops an entirely new product and takes it to market globally, right? The next one is new to market domestic, develop a new product, only take it to market in Australia. International modifiers are people that basically take international ideas and do an Australian version, copycat. Domestic modifier is modify an existing business and build a derivative or a similar business. And what you can see here is that there's virtually no, like almost zero, new to market internationally, and even a very small number of new to market domestically innovations. I look at this and maybe the term is harsh, but to be brutally honest, when I saw this data, I said, man, Australia is a bunch of copycats. That's what we do. We take international ideas and do the Australian version of that. And to me, and that was the whole genesis, I'll stop here. The genesis was, what's wrong with this picture? There's so many bright, talented Australians. We've got the CRCs, we've got a great university infrastructure. Some of the most pervasive inventions have come out of Australia that are used globally. But the problem is, I think that innovation is really misunderstood. Innovation is the creativity and invention, and it's the commercialization. And that commercialization piece is completely absent. The ecosystem's broken. You guys know it. You've tried to raise money. It's broken. And that's what we need to fix.
So, Adrian, also out of your book, the 10 areas, and Michael, I think, made a great point that Australia is incredibly strong and world-class research and technology invention in its universities. And certain areas we invented Wi-Fi, we discovered sleep apnea and invented the cure for it. There have been a ton of phenomenal innovations, but very few of them, get into products. Duron, 6 startups. In your interview with the Minister for Innovation, when he said, why do you want to be a public servant? You said, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make to do the job.
No, I didn't exactly say that. What I actually said was, I never said I wanted to be a public servant. Okay, so what Adrian and Mick just said pretty much answers the question you asked. So why would I get involved with the government? Because we've got a problem to fix. And I like living in Australia. So there are 2 options to solve the problem. Leave and go somewhere where it's not as broken, or think about how you can fix it. So I tried to fix it by raising a fund. My timing wasn't very good on that. And even if I had raised a fund, or closed the fund, because I did raise it, even if I had closed the fund, that wouldn't solve the problem, because the problem is systemic and it's cultural. And one fund, and Larry can talk to this better than I can now, but one fund does not fix that. One fund can try to succeed despite that. But really what we all want, what we all really want is to get that systemic problem addressed. So that the valley of death that Larry was talking about, where you've got this sort of preponderance of capital sitting in the hands of people that don't know where to put it, on one side, and you've got a lot of money going into creating intellectual property on the other side, but a lack of realization in terms of what it takes to convert that intellectual property back into money, which is the commercialization piece, which is what innovation really is. Innovation is not invention. There are 2 different words because there's 2 different meanings. Invention plus commercialization equals innovation. And what we need to understand culturally as a society is that commercialization piece is not important, it's essential. And it shouldn't be the poor cousin, it's in fact the rich cousin. Because if you talk to any multinational corporation that has perfected product development and marketing, they will tell you that for every dollar they spend on R&D, there's $100 behind that product becoming successful in the marketplace.
Great point.
It's 100 to 1, the other way. And we've got it 100 to 1 the wrong way. Right? We're assuming that if we pump it into R&D, it's going to come out as products in the marketplace, and it's just not going to happen that way. So that's the problem we have to address. So that's the long answer. The short answer is, so by getting involved with government, and we can talk about CA when you're ready, but by getting involved with the government, there are things that the government is good at, and there's a whole bunch of things government's no good at. So the reason I got involved was to try, as best I could as one person, which is limited in its capacity, I admit, to get focus on the things that government could be really good at that would help. as distinct from doing a whole bunch of stuff that isn't going to help.
So, Doron, Adrian, Michael, I'm going to run through quickly the 9 other areas where Australia needs support or change. Risk tolerance is one, access to sophisticated risk capital is another. Adrian made 2 recommendations. One was focused investments aligned with national interests, and the idea of allocating a small portion of the Future Fund to the commercialisation of innovation. I can tell you the Future Fund is probably the worst named fund ever, because they're not about the future. Just to give a background on this, these 2 charts show US venture over the last 10 years, and Australian venture. US is sort of 20 to 30 billion. Australian venture is less than 1/100th of US VC as a percentage of private equity. So the fraction of US VC to private equity in Australia, less than 1/100th of what it is in the US. It's a massive misalignment. And the Aussie VC is plotted on the US VC down there, and that yellow line that you can't see at the bottom. So Adrian, you're absolutely right. There's a massive lack of risk capital. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so risk capital is really at all stages. So it's angel investing. So Ron Conway, for example, is invested in my business, Makana. And back to the earlier discussion, it's connections. It's a lot of value add. And then you move through to the VC, and it's all of the things we talked about before in terms of not only access to people, but discipline and structure and help accelerating the business. Then you move to private equity or LBO, and there's been some late stage investing here from people like Andreessen Horowitz and DST, which I'm not convinced is long-term viable as much as an aberration in the market, but there's sophisticated capital at that end. And then right through to NASDAQ. I don't think Silicon Valley would exist in the way it does today had NASDAQ not have broken off from the New York Stock Exchange. That gives a mechanism for investors to get liquidity and get their money back. In Australia, that doesn't exist. You kind of, yes, there are some angel networks forming, which is great. VC, we've talked about, is on the brink of collapse. Private equity, there's Macquarie Bank, and they do a fine job. But even at the ASX level, there's not the analyst infrastructure to help the retail investor really assess risk, which translates to lower trading volumes, which translates to lower liquidity, which makes the ASX not as an attractive option for listing a company.
And positive aggregate returns is your other one.
Yeah, so positive aggregate returns is huge, right? So the Silicon Valley 150, the leading 150 companies, the market cap, this is just the 150 companies. In Silicon Valley, 2.2 million people, the geographic area is no bigger than Greater Sydney, is $1.55 trillion. The whole ASX market cap is 1.4 trillion, of which 70% of that is commodities based. So you have to, it's not, I know when I look at the media in Australia, there's a huge celebration for a $30 or a $40 million deal. And it just doesn't provide the positive aggregate returns for the market overall.
How about on the venture side?
On the venture side for
positive aggregate returns.
So if you look at the US, for example, I mean, because of all the ecosystem conditions here, you've got venture firms, and I know these are exceptional returns, but you know, you look at someone like a Benchmark that invested in eBay and turned millions of dollars into, you know, north of $5 billion. So it's this positive spiral where the best firms are able to provide the sorts of returns, positive in aggregate, that attract LPs. And the thing that, one of the reasons for writing this book that really frankly pissed me off was when I was meeting Australian LPs that were coming over here and talking to them, what are you doing? We're here to invest in US-based venture firms. Why? Because we can't get the return domestically. And I know it's free market capital is going to go to the place that provides it the best return, but something's wrong with that picture if all the LPs and pension funds and future funds are all hopping on aeroplanes to come over here and invest in US-based VCs.
So this chart compares Australian venture and US venture in terms of cash-on-cash multiple. I don't know if any of you have seen this data before. But a couple of things. The average return across all US funds is around 2x the money. Some do 2.5. That's an average number. Some firms, outliers in the top decile, do 3 or 4x, but that's hard. Australian venture is thought to be negative, and there are some funds that are negative. But what I was sort of shocked at was 2x return average for US, 2, 2.1, 1.6, and 1.3. So one of those data points is the very first government venture fund, AAF fund, which returned 2.1. And the others are all privately funded. Now, that's a very sparse amount of data. There aren't a lot of venture funds in Australia. I got this from key partners who are LPs in those funds. There are about 20 other data points that could be on there if you had the data, which I don't. Something you might misread in the chart, venture doesn't fall off a cliff in '99. The problem is that funds go for 10 years, they invest for 5 years, so for the first 5 or 6 years of the fund, you can't really work out the net asset value of the fund because the companies all go into negative territory. They all go through the valley of death, and it's a few years before they come out. And to put it in perspective, I put the data taken 3 years earlier and 3 years before that on there, just so you get an overlay. So there's always this look like it's falling off a cliff because you've got this sort of 5-year period where you can't really work out the returns. So Australian venture had some reasonable results on par with US, but it only started in '99. And it's gone through 2 major financial crises, one of them the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. So it's a pretty tough time for Australian venture for that reason. But still, I was surprised the numbers of some of them were actually pretty good. Adrian, globally experienced repeat entrepreneurs were your next issue, and then I'd like you guys to now sort of chime in together on your perspectives on this too, please.
Okay, so take one entrepreneur, right, that started Zip2, that was acquired by Lycos, $300 million. Same guy goes on to start PayPal, sold for $1.5 billion. Same guy goes on to start Tesla, electric car company, market cap $3.5 billion. Same guy starts SpaceX, that's putting private payloads into space, that just landed in the last 12 months a $1 billion contract from NASA, and is a primary financier in Solar City, one of the big financial solar installers. The guy's 40 years old, 40. So you have this phenomenon here where people don't check out the ecosystem when they achieve a lot of success. They give back, and they give back in many ways. They give time on board, advisory board, they invest money back, but it's this pay it forward culture. And in Australia, we're starting to see some repeat entrepreneurs, but we need to see more. And when people do achieve success, they can't check out. You can't go sit on a beach. There's an obligation, I think, to give back.
So, Deron, Commercialisation Australia is doing a ton about this issue, and it'd be great for you to share that with the group here.
Yeah, okay, so Adrian's point's really important, but you can't just look at the repeat success of an individual entrepreneur in isolation, because they don't achieve it in isolation. So the really important thing to understand is the extent to which the ecosystem here impacts the possibility of achieving that for that individual. Now, that individual is obviously an outstanding person, but not one of those companies would they have done alone. And they would have been supported by a bunch of people within this ecosystem that made that possible. And it feeds off itself, so it becomes self-fulfilling. And when it's at critical mass and it's feeding off itself, it's even more impressive. So what we need to be careful of is not thinking that as Australia we could replicate Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has some unique properties. We can learn from it, but we can't replicate it. We are a subcritical market, number one. Number two, we don't have very many of those phenomenally successful entrepreneurs in the commercializing of new IP discipline. We have a lot of very rich people who made a lot of money out of mining, out of retail, property development, right? And if you put a technology in front of them, they're not going to have a clue what to do. Some of them have tried, they realize it's not so easy, and now they're back at property development. So the super rich in our market haven't got the experience necessary to do this. And those that do have the raw talent to do it don't have the ecosystem to leverage. Plus, we don't have the infrastructure in situ that makes it easy on the commercialisation end. What we were talking about before is we do have the infrastructure on the research end. So we're definitely punching world class in terms of the generation of raw IP. But in terms of converting that, we're not punching world class.
But are we? Like,
sorry?
Because another way to read that graph that was put up about all this investment in R&D is maybe we're investing in the wrong things that aren't commercially viable.
I'm not saying that everything we're investing in is the right thing. That's a totally different discussion. But I think in terms of our capacity to generate IP, person for person, engineer for engineer, scientist for scientist, we're as good as anywhere. But that's clearly insufficient. Right? So what we need to do is start to build the infrastructure around which we can start to build the experience to the point where we systematically attract the talent necessary to start building the commercialization ecosystem as distinct from the R&D ecosystem, which is much healthier relatively speaking. I'm not saying it's perfect in all areas, but it's much healthier relatively. And unfortunately though, most of our resource to date has gone into that R&D ecosystem and continues to, because there's a misunderstanding of the process, which is you pump it into R&D and miraculously you'll get companies out the other end that will demonstrate innovation in your marketplace, and it just doesn't happen that way.
So I'll just take a different slant on that. I mean, I agree broadly with what you've said. I think it's the case, I tend to look at it as the culture. The culture within Australia is different to the culture here in the entrepreneurial space. I'm fortunate to have an American working for me. He's gone through the commercialisation process here and also in Australia. And I asked him, well, what's the difference between Australia and the US? And he says entrepreneurship and commercialisation and wanting to get out there and do it is part of the DNA here. It's just part of the culture. It's just embedded in them from day one. So any money that goes into research here, and there's a lot of money that goes into research here and filters down the process, it comes out and there's a group of, you know, the whole nation is really up and ready to go and pick up the ideas and run with them. In Australia, that's not the case. We've got to try and change the culture so that, you know, people can get up and they can have a go, they can do things, and it doesn't matter if they fail. Now, I get a sense that's changing. I just remember back, 5 years back, and every PhD student there, what they were going to do when they left, half of them were going to go and join the City of London, and the other half were going to set up startup companies. And that's all they talked about, all the time. I went to Australia, probably about 25 years ago, and nothing. None of the PhD students, they're all going to become postdocs. They're all going to just go on and do their research here. They're all going to become academics. The problem we have now is that we've got a lot of PhD students, and we're going to go, only about 20% of them are going to become academics. So there's going to be all these PhDs out there, and PhD graduates which have been growing over the last 10 years or so, which are going to need things to do. And I think we can create an environment where we can actually, you know, get some of those guys who I think could be motivated to actually start picking up and running with the commercialisation process.
So that's a great segue into Adrian's next point, which is constructive failure, which is related to the tall poppy question that was asked in the previous session, and the whole cultural issue in Australia.
So definitely part of it is culture. So I don't know how many people in the room know that, you know, Twitter was a side project from a company that was started that was called Odeo. And Jack Dorsey, that company was going, but it wasn't going fast enough, and turned around and offered to give money back to his investors if they wanted to invest in this, and offered them the chance to invest in this side project that was called Twitter. So that can happen here, and it doesn't happen in Australia. You have companies that are living dead, right? They're in purgatory. It either evolves to become a lifestyle business, or it just doesn't grow fast enough. Let me give you another example of culture, and this is some anecdotes. So I went down to Canberra to speak with the leadership of the country around the book. And I talked with Doran before I was going down, and Doran asked me, and I told him I was meeting with the opposition leader responsible for innovation. And he asked me, can you ask her these 4 or 5 questions? And I said, why don't you ask her? And he said, I can't. So here you've got a guy who's trying to build or solve the commercialisation problem that can't walk down the corridor in Parliament House and have a conversation with the opposition leader, where this is clearly a whole of country issue. When I sat in front of that person, one of the solutions is to do things like this and beam the experiences of global entrepreneurs into high schools. Get to kids while you can, expand their minds. And the response I got? There's no way we can do that because the teachers' union will flip out. Forget about it. It's like, what's wrong with that picture?
So, Doron, the companies that have been successful innovating in Australia, you want to talk a little bit about that? And also, Commercialisation Australia has invested in well over 200 companies. Well, not so much invested, but given grants to well over 200 companies, and mentorship and networking and experience and hands-on involvement. You want to?
Okay, so the purpose of Commercialisation Australia, it exists on a few levels. So simply, it's to provide resources to companies at a time when it's extremely difficult for them to get resource. Effectively to drive their dollar further, because they do have to raise some private money, and then we will match it subject to a competitive process. And the idea there is obviously to extend the runway that they've got to get to the next inflection point where hopefully they can raise money commercially with greater ease. Granted, there aren't that many sources in terms of venture money, but Commercialisation Australia takes a broader view of the commercialisation process. It's not just about venture backable businesses. That's a small subset of the overall business community. Yes, the very successful venture-backed companies are going to change the world in certain ways, true, but a heck of a lot more businesses are going to be built that don't change the world, but they do give expression to good IPs. So the main focus of Commercialisation Australia is to give commercial expression to good intellectual property. If out of that a subset have got real paradigm shifting capability, fantastic, but the prime purpose of our program is a bit broader than purely the venture interest. But in terms of successes, there's been a lot of successful companies, successful in the sense that they've made some money for their founders. They haven't been a dead loss situation. Very few have hit the high notes of an Atlassian or whatever in terms of being on the world stage. Clearly we need to get more of that if Australia is going to get noticed by the world's investors and by the world's big money sources. But fundamentally we do have a lot of business creating capability. We've got 250 companies in Commercialisation Australia right now. And a number of the ones at the top end of that range are kicking some serious goals internationally, not just in Australia. They're getting international customers, building revenues, they're commercially successful, they will be commercially successful businesses, whether or not they raise venture money. Some of them already have, some of them will. And many of them won't, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Some of them will just be 10, 15, $20 million companies at best. That's okay. We need them too, because it's all about building the ecosystem up so that we get more people with the experience of doing this, who then might get involved in the next one, and eventually we'll get more of the large success stories which build the attraction of the investor class. But we're not going to tap into our superannuation money and get them freely investing in that early stage sector in Australia until not just they see success, but the professional investor class, the VCs of the world, the top tier VCs of the world, see successes coming out of Australia systematically.